the shift from a geopolitical project to I'm sorry, geoeconomic project to a geopolitical project. And I remember that shift because it was subtle, but it wasn't that subtle. It's like, yeah, how did you go broke? A little at a time, and then all at once, kind of like that. And all of a sudden, right, it's now strictly geopolitical. Do you think that was done on purpose, or just something that they just stumbled into over time, shifting more and more, and then falling off the cliff? Or that
Well,
was
if you go back
the
20,
job to jump off that cliff?
well, if you go back 20 years, there was some reason for optimism. The early 2000s in terms of what the geoeconomic Europe could achieve, which was
Right.
some parity with the United States, because this was still under the hegemonic moment. The US was the world hegemon, so the ambition of the Europeans was, well, the unipolar moment's great, but let's make it one of collective hegemony. The hegemon
Yeah.
should stand on two legs, the US and the EU. And that time, there was more parity in terms of economic power. Of course, the Americans still had a technological advantage and the financial power, but nonetheless, there was some hope. And well, my argument was always that the vulnerability for the Europeans was to maintain a divided Europe, because for many Europeans they saw redividing the continent was a necessary recipe for keeping the West together. But it also has a different problem to it. That is a divided Europe, which becomes increasingly militarized. It will also be one that is more weaker, more vulnerable. So it's not going to have the same economic potential. That is, imagine if the Europe, EU would try to find some common cause with Russia, or who has
Yeah.
some higher degree of technological sovereignty, at least a more autonomous digital ecosystem. We could have done stuff together. We would also have less security problems if we could end these dividing lines. And when this is not and without the security problems, we would also be less dependent on the US, which would mean more political. And essentially, the goal for the Europeans was let's grow the economies, which
Mm-hmm.
is not now being done. And all they also
The
talked
opposite.
about European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. All this means let's be an independent actor, not just a vassal of America. Well, this isn't going to happen, is it? If you're going to go into conflict with Russia, then you're not going to be able to keep your independence because America will own you. And it was predictable that this would happen. I mean, when EU and NATO expand eastwards, what happens when you reach these societies which were deeply divided, especially Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova? You're going to spark internal conflicts, and then you're going to invite the external actors, that is the NATO and Russia, to support each side. So this was always destined to happen, and it was predictable. And once that happens, it's not going to bring back the glorious Cold War, where you have a generous America, showering the Europeans with generous trade deals and free security and political unity. No, you're going to have a very different world, a world where the US hegemon is well, gone, and they will begin to cannibalize their allies instead. And yeah, so I think we paint ourselves in a horrible corner, and yeah, there's no discussions about course correction.
Well, we saw a preview of this in Yugoslavia, the whole tragedy of Yugoslavia, and on top of that, you also had the more radical jihadist elements, which turned out to be backed somewhat by the U.S. also. Um, and then you had the pro, I guess the pro West Croatian side, and then the pro East Serbian side, and you had a three-way civil war going on, and NATO intervened. I mean, we all saw what happened there. So they had a preview of that, but just nobody learned anything, or maybe that whetted their hunger.
No, I think, well, in the Yugoslav wars are remembered, I think, across Europe as, good wars, which, because, well, they buy into the moral spin of them. And I don't think, yeah, at the end of the day, Yugoslavia ended up broken up, weaker and more
Yeah,
obedient. And
mission
yeah,
accomplished.
so, sorry?
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, very much so. Well, it's
Sad.
it is. So No, I think we could have had a very different Europe. And if you go back to the early 90s, there were some discussions about this. This was, especially the French were making the point that, perhaps it would be a good idea to develop a new Europe which has the Russians on the inside, because such a Europe would be would not have such a concentration of power in the United States. And if we don't, we would likely become vassals, and this is true. And I don't think the Europeans appreciated this by making a by this insisting on making an enemy out of Russia again. It also made the Europeans very weak and vulnerable. But like I said, 35 years ago, we could have discussed these things openly. These days, no, it's not possible.
Yeah, it's very sad. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that is what it is. Um, and now they're talking about. I don't know if this is set in stone, but I've seen reports that the European harvest is going to be up to 40% smaller than last year's. Do you think the EU is just going to let that go and possibly have starvation in the lower classes, literal starvation, or they're going to intervene, or and if they do intervene, what can they do? Particularly since Ukraine is no longer able to get any of that grain out of the Black Sea being closed.
I don't have any good answer. This is all uncharted territory. We haven't, been in this position before. That is, we have these decades of globalization, maximize efficiency, all markets tied together, and also which included outsourcing a lot of critical products, and including agricultural products. But now, um, well, it's again, these are the things you would assume would be discussed, but it's not. You look in the papers, it's everything is Ukraine this, Ukraine that, Putin is evil. I mean, imagine, well, there's no analysis of the different options that should be taken. So, for example, the decision to go and attack all these Russian ships and do this 40-day deep strikes inside Russia, uh, you know, this is linked very much to food shortages coming up, because the Russians showed that if when they were presented with the potential of a grain deal, the Russians took it. They said, okay, well, we'll go with this predictability. And not everyone was happy with it, of course. And of course, Russia was also influenced by the global south, that they wanted agricultural exports to continue. But but when the decision was made to do this 40-day campaign, well, what did they think would happen? They knew that the Russians could retaliate. They knew that the Ukrainians were running low on air defenses. Uh, they also knew that if we attack all the Russian ships, why wouldn't they do the same? And now you have that exact thing happening in Ukraine. That is a naval blockade on Ukraine. The grains are coming out. They say trains and all this, but you can't just reroute all this agricultural export and put it on trains. It's I'm not sure people know how this works, but anyways, so you would assume that there would have been some discussions around this. Well, what might be the consequence? But it's not. It's just either you support it, or you're questioning it. But then that's for the benefit of Russia, essentially. I moved to this country back, I mean, to this country after 20 years abroad, and I lived there for 6 years. I've been contacted by journalists like 20, 30 times. Not once have they actually asked about anything, any topic, any issue, any foreign policy issue, that, what is the role of Europe? How can we, what do the Russians want? What are the possibilities of us? No. It's always ad hominem. It's always the person that is, why did you travel to Russia? Why did you publish there? Who did you speak with? Did someone pay for your plane ticket? Have you received money from Russian media? So they're out to get you, because if you don't fall in line, then they're coming for you. There's no debate, there's no discussion, and it's no it. I mean, it's what can you say? I think a lot of these problems could have been avoided if there would have been minimal discussion. Just how did any of this serve Western interests? How did it serve Ukrainian interests? I mean, it's a lot of what's being done is very short-sighted.
Yeah, yeah. Well, last time we talked about it, we were talking about that there weren't any more Russian experts. That knowing your opponent, whether it's your enemy or a friend, was verboten. But you can do things like that. You can do it all you want, but if there's not enough food, there's just not enough food. I mean, a 40% drop in crop yields is going to skyrocket the cost of food. Never mind, there's just not going to be enough food. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, it's going to happen, but I mean, what's going to happen? How's the EU going to handle this? Because like it or not, it's coming. It's that train flying down that tunnel that everybody's in. It's not the end of the tunnel. That's the headlight on the train. Uh, what do you think their actions are going to be? What actions are they going to take, if any?
Well, it's hard to say. They're a regulatory power. They can make big statements, and often this is where the energy goes to come up with this common statements. But they can't print weapons. They can't make statements to change opinions of other leaders. And they're gonna discover they can't magically make food appear by by signing some decree. It's so no, I don't not sure if they have any good solutions. I don't think there's anyone really behind the wheel anymore either. So um, no, again, this is like as I said before, it's uncharted territory, and we don't hear much of the plans at all because if you bring up these questions. What you're suggesting is that some of the policies are not working. You have to change them. But you can't do that either. I mean, this is something I discovered as well because, I used to, for the past 12 years, like in academia, I used to focus a lot on the Greater Eurasia Project, that is Russia reorienting its economy towards the east. And I was making the point when they began with these sanctions against Russia and they thought the ruble would, and the entire Russian economy would collapse before the weekend. I
Right,
was
right.
making the point that
Well, they
it's
gave
not
it
going
two
to,
weeks. They gave it two
yeah,
weeks.
2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I was making the point it's not going to happen. The Russians have made their economy largely bulletproof because they're not that dependent on the West anymore. But everyone was ideologically committed to the idea that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. This McCain nonsense.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, most important of all is it was immediately slandered as being pro-Russian, and it's like, well, how is it pro-Russian to argue that I make the point why the sanctions won't work? Oh well, if you say that, then it's the effect is to reduce trust in the sanctions, which means it will not have much political support. So, reality is a social construction for them. That is, if you say it doesn't work, then it won't work. So, if we all just pretend it works, then we'll commit to it and eventually it will work. This is the whole logic. So, if you make the point, yeah, if you expand NATO, you try to pull Ukraine into the orbit, you can cite any Western higher, like political leader, intelligence chiefs, whatever it would be. It doesn't matter. What you're suggesting is that we have helped to provoke this, and if we only reach out to the Russians, then perhaps we can come up with a deal. Well, that's going to undermine support for the war. And this is dependent on boycotting diplomacy and chanting that weapons are the path to peace. So you're undermining the narrative. So this is also pro-Russian, which by the way, it's never unpacked as a concept. We
Yeah.
all have to hate Russia here. So no, it's there's no debate anymore. It's just it's narratives and it's they're protected to a very high degree. So
This sounds so much, particularly like the early Soviet Union, where everybody was afraid to say anything against the policy, no matter how idiotic the policy was. It just sounds so much like that. It's ludicrous. But I guess societies kind of repeat their own mistakes or repeat the mistakes of their neighbors. They go through the same phases.
yeah, well, and we were supposed to avoid that though because we were supposed to be liberal democracy, so you're supposed to be allowed to speak out. But something interesting happened. That is, liberalism kind of turned on itself. That is, because within liberalism there's a contradiction. On one hand, you're supposed to be able to, everyone has their own path to or vision of the good life. You're supposed to be able to challenge everything. On the other side, you assume that there's one answer to progress. So you come up with all these liberal principles, and you can't challenge them. So especially from the 90s, it came the idea that, oh, well, my migration is good for society. This is the liberal thing. We can't like, get stuck in, nationalism. And then it was agreed. And anyone who went opposed to mass migration, that meant you're a racist. So suddenly you shut down all discussion because it was a liberal principle and you're not allowed to challenge it. And you had the same with all this everything from, gay marriage and all the LGBT stuff that I see. Well, if you want marriage to be, as an institution, you believe it should be best preserved by maintaining it as a, the family unit that is a man and a woman. Well, then you hate gays. Okay, so now you're not allowed to say this So only a few years ago, if you remember Clinton and Obama, they all said that, a marriage should be between a man and woman. You're not allowed
Yep.
to say that because then you hate the gays, they say. So, and you're a bigot. So suddenly you criminalized opposition there as well. And you do the same also with wars. That is because whatever war we go into, it's always humanitarian. We in Yugoslavia, we really, really cared about, well, there was many wars, but and the last one, 99, we really cared about, human rights of Albanians. In Syria, oh, it was, Assad killing his own people. The same script in Libya. It's always this Iran, oh, we just want to liberate little girls. It's always this kind of it is human rights way of selling wars, which means that if you oppose it, you just don't care. Because if you really care, you would want to bomb them. But if you care about the Iranians, you wouldn't oppose bombing. If you cared about the Libyans, you wouldn't oppose bombing. And this is always the logic. So you use liberal principles to essentially shut down any debate, and it's the same now with this proxy war on Russia. It's well, if you want to negotiate with the Russians, well, then you don't care about the Ukrainians. Well, we know that what's going to happen if this war continues. The Ukrainian nation itself might be destroyed, but you know you're still anti-Ukrainian if you if you think that we should sit down with the Russians. It doesn't have to make any sense. You just create this position where you criminalize all opposition.
Right before the Iran war kicked off, I was on a video debate with a guy. I don't remember his name, Scott something or other. He was described to me as a George Bush Republican. He's like, yes, we're going to go into Iran and we're going to liberate the women. I'm like, well, first of all, did you even ask the women if they wanted to be liberated? And how do you get? Who gives you the right to go quote liberate somebody in some other society? Well, that's our duty is to go liberate them by bombing them. And he didn't have much anything to say to that. He was on that platform. We're liberating them. Never mind that we have to kill half of them to liberate them and burn their societies down. But you're right, and it's just the moment you challenge them, they don't have any depth for their arguments. It's just take it. It's faith. It's a radical religion.
No, no. Again, yeah, they don't unpack these things. It's this slogans which sounds nice, but this is often what one also does when you build a case for war. You come first up with a concept which everyone would agree with, but it's like an empty vessel. You can fill it with whatever you want. So, well, this is what we essentially heard, not just since 2014, but beyond that is, oh, we have to support Ukrainians' right to choose their own future. Okay, well, that sounds like a lovely concept. Everyone can get on board. But what do you put into this? Well, that was used for a reason why Yanukovych had to be toppled. He was democratically elected. We know that the majority of Ukrainians didn't support the toppling of Yanukovych. The majority didn't support Maidan. The majority, um, you know, the, there's no support for this. Also, that since 91 to at least 2014, it was about 20% of Ukrainians, sometimes went up to 24% of Ukrainians who even wanted NATO membership. But
Yep. Yep.
this was also necessary to stand with Ukraine to let them choose themselves. And in 2019, they elected Zelensky on this peace platform where they're going to make peace with Donbass, Russia, implement the Minsk agreement. Well, this is capitulation. We have to help Ukraine stand up to this Russian pressure. So now, helping them entails ignoring what 73% voted for.
Yep.
So you come with a concept everyone can get on board with. Let's be tolerant, and then okay, well then we can't have borders anymore. Okay, let's help Ukrainians because they're suffering. Okay, wonderful, sign me up. Okay, well then we just have to dismantle their democracy, arm some right-wing extremists, and send them into war. And then once they're in war, boycott all diplomacy, chant that weapons are the path to peace, and sit on the sideline and watch these people get massacred. I mean, it's wild, but people speak in slogans, and the slogans, they build up this initial consensus, and then people stick to it.
Yep. You are absolutely right. It's a sad state of affairs, but that's where we're at. Um, Glenn, I want to thank you for joining the program. You're always a great guest. Um, Unfortunately, we never have these happy topics.
No, I was
Not
gonna
even
say.
a little one. Just every one of I don't think anybody even asks anyone, why do you guys laugh? Because you either laugh or you cry. I think everybody's really figured that out. It's either cry in a corner or kind of do the gallows humor laugh. Um,
There's research into this actually. They found out in Bosnia as well that when a country has gone when this times looks dark, they often develop dark humor as a way of coping. So, and these are dark times indeed,
yeah.
So yeah, there has, we can't just curl up in a ball and cry all day, I guess.
Well, so some people would love us to do that. That's what antidepressants are for. You make a lot. um, on that topic, I don't know if it's true or not, but I was reading that Americans make up 70% of the world's usage of antidepressants, which is, if you think about it, is really, really insane. But yeah, I guess a lot of people curl up in the ball and cry, and that's one way. Laughing is better, no matter how dark the humor is.
Yeah. Now the pharmaceutical industry in the US needs to be put under control, but there's no money in that, so I don't expect it to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like with a lot of things, unfortunately. You've got the arms industry is gone insane, and you need the pharmaceuticals. Which, by the way, the pharmaceutical industry made a lot of money off of this Ukrainian war, drugging up Ukrainian soldiers, combat drugs. So, on that note, and that's going to flow, if it hasn't already flown back, that's going to flow back into Europe too, in the narcotics industry. It's just insane quantities that were just given out, shipped in. Especially, it's starting in 2014, but I mean, it really took off in 22. So there's that to deal with too. So
Yeah, so yeah, which underscores the point. This no, there's not a lot of positive things happening these days. So, but yeah, it's I'm starting to think this war it can't go on forever now, though. Because it's intensifying in such a massive way. Either I think it's going to blow up to a direct war between NATO and Russia, or it's going to have to collapse because I don't know. I watched daily how the Russian strikes on Odessa, Kiev are intensifying, the destruction of all this logistics, its supplies, and this it can't continue in this pace anymore. So this is either the time for escalate or or capitulate. So I think
yeah,
it's not going to be capitulation, but this era, this stage of the war, it can't go on for that much longer, I think.
true, very true. Um, well, we'll see what happens, and we can discuss it in a week or two, and then hopefully, maybe always end on a bright side. Maybe we'll have some good news.
Yeah, no, I would welcome that.
Yeah,
Maybe then we can finish on a positive note.
just once.
Yeah,
Glenn, thank you very much one more time. And if you can make the youth conference and everything, glad to see you there too.
great. No, I'll look into it.
Yep. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.